Following the First World War, the old political order in Europe shattered. Fragile democracies found themselves unable to stabilize local economies or manage a rising fear of communist revolution, leaving a power vacuum that invited a different kind of leadership. This instability gave birth to fascism, a movement that promised to restore national glory and social order through absolute authoritarian control. These regimes functioned through a cult of personality, convincing the public that a single leader was the nation's only savior. This sea of identical silhouettes shows how successfully the movement replaced individual identity with mass mobilization. Millions of people surrendered their personal will to the state, believing that a total sacrifice of freedom was a fair trade for the promise of total security. To build this state, the regime systematically dismantled the infrastructure of democracy. They outlawed opposition parties and suspended civil rights, using events like the fire at the German Parliament building as visual proof that the old laws were no longer enough to protect the nation. Power was stripped from local institutions and funneled upward to a single node of absolute command. This rigid architecture created a terrifyingly efficient war machine. Controlled from one central point, the state mobilized for expansion with a speed that overwhelmed Europe's remaining democracies. But a system that relies entirely on the absolute authority of one man cannot tolerate the concept of retreat. By building a military that was forbidden from adapting to failure, the regime set a trap for its own soldiers. In 1942, Hitler expanded his goals for the invasion of the Soviet Union. He diverted the Sixth Army away from vital oil fields and toward a city on the Volga River, plunging his soldiers into a dense, burning landscape simply because the city bore the name of his rival, Joseph Stalin. This environment neutralized the German military's greatest strength, mechanized blitzkrieg. In the jagged rubble of the city streets, tanks were pinned down, and aircraft were unable to distinguish friend from foe, forcing the German army to fight a slow, primitive war on foot. The Soviets weaponized this chaos with a hugging tactic. By keeping their front lines only a few yards away from the Germans, they made it impossible for the Luftwaffe to drop bombs without risking the lives of their own men. The battle devolved into a rat war, or Rattenkrieg. In these gutted shells of apartment blocks and factories, thousands of small, isolated groups fought hand-to-hand for control of individual basements and sewers. This environment demanded that junior officers make split-second, independent decisions. But the German system required Hitler's personal consent for even a tactical withdrawal from a single trench or building. Because the chain of command was locked to a distant leader who refused to delegate authority, the German defense stalled while Soviet assault groups moved freely through the ruins. While the Sixth Army was paralyzed in the city center, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Large armored columns and mounted infantry swept across the thinly guarded Axis flanks, completing a massive encirclement of over 300,000 troops in just 4 days. General Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, realized the danger immediately. He signaled his headquarters, requesting an immediate breakout before the Soviet ring became too thick to pierce. Hitler's response was a rigid command to stand fast and fight to the last bullet. From his headquarters thousands of miles away, he forbade any attempt at a retreat, prioritizing the prestige of holding the city over the lives of his soldiers. The high command fed the trapped men a delusion. They promised a massive aerial supply chain that was physically impossible to maintain, while telling the German public that the siege was a heroic struggle rather than a terminal trap. The Sixth Army was caught between the Soviet armor outside the pocket and an ideological ban on retreat from within. By prioritizing the leader's image over military reality, the system ensured that its finest divisions remained stationary until they were destroyed. By January 1943, the situation inside the pocket was agonizing. Thousands of men were suffering from starvation, sub-zero temperatures, and typhus, with zero remaining ammunition and no hope of rescue. Soviet commanders offered Paulus a chance to surrender, promising medical care and eventual repatriation for his men. Again, Hitler rejected the terms, ordering his soldiers to die at their posts for the honor of the Reich. On the anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. It was a strategic promotion with a clear, dark implication. In the history of the German military, no field marshal had ever been taken alive. This was a direct order to commit suicide. Hitler expected Paulus to kill himself to protect the dictator's myth of an invincible, unwavering leadership. Paulus chose to break the system's most fundamental rule. He disobeyed the order, refused suicide, and surrendered the remnants of the Sixth Army. The aesthetic of the invincible warrior was gone. These shivering, blanket-wrapped prisoners became the physical evidence of a systemic political failure. Stalingrad was the end of the fascist myth. It proved that a system built on the unquestioned delusion of one man will eventually collide with reality, resulting in its own destruction.